5. On the road. Monday morning, the 6th of January, Dom Corvasis cruised his old Portland neighborhood in a rented Chevrolet, trying to recapture the mood he had been in when he had left Oregon for Mountain View, Utah, more than 18 months ago. The rain, as heavy as any he had ever seen, had stopped near dawn. Now the sky, though still cloudy from horizon to horizon, was a particularly powdery, dry-looking shade of gray, like a burnt field, as if there had been a fire behind the clouds that forced out all of that precipitation. He drove through the university campus, stopping repeatedly to let the familiar scenes stir feelings and attitudes of times past. He parked across the street from the apartment where he had lived, and as he stared up at the windows, he tried to recall the man he had been then. He was surprised at how difficult it was to recollect the timidity with which that other Dom Corvasis had viewed life. Though he could bring to mind the way he had been, there was no intimacy or poignancy to those memories. He could see those old days again, but he could not feel them, which seemed to indicate that he could never be that old Dom again, regardless of how much he feared the possibility. He was convinced that he had seen something terrible on the road the summer before last, and that something monstrous had been done to him. But that conviction generated both a mystery and a contradiction. The mystery was that the event had wrought in him an undeniably positive change. How could an experience fraught with pain and terror effect a beneficial change in his outlook? The contradiction was that, in spite of the beneficial effect on his personality, the event filled his dreams with horror. How could his ordeal have been both terrifying and positive, both horrible and uplifting at the same time? The answer, if it could be found, was not here in Portland, but out on the highway. He started the engine, put the Chevy in gear, pulled away from his old apartment building, and went looking for trouble. The most direct route from Portland to Mountain View began with Interstate 80 North, but as he had done 19 months ago, Dom took a more roundabout trail heading south on Interstate 5. That special summer, he had scheduled a layover in Reno for a few days to do some research for a series of short stories about gambling, so the less direct route had been necessary. Now on his rented Chevy, he followed the familiar highway, keeping his speed down to 50, even as low as 40 on the steeper hills, for he had been pulling a U-Haul trailer that last day in June, and he had not made good time. And as before, he stopped for lunch in Eugene. Hoping to spot something that would goose his memory and provide a link with the mysterious events of the previous trip, Dom looked over the small towns that he passed. However, he saw nothing that made him uneasy, and nothing bad happened all the way to Grants Pass, where he arrived shortly before 6 o'clock that evening, right on schedule. He stayed in the motel where he had been a guest 18 months ago. He remembered the number of the room, 10, because it was near the soft drink and ice machines, which had been the source of irritating noises half the night. It was unoccupied, and he took it, vaguely explaining to the clerk that it had sentimental associations for him. He ate at the same restaurant across the road from the motel. He was seeking Satori, which was a Zen word meaning sudden enlightenment, a profound revelation, but enlightenment eluded him. All day he had used the rearview mirror, hoping to spot a tail. During dinner, he surreptitiously watched the other customers, but if he was being followed, his tail was masterful and visible. At 9 o'clock, rather than use the telephone in his room, he walked to a nearby service station payphone. With his credit card, he placed a call to the number of another payphone in Laguna Beach. By prearrangement, Parker Fane was waiting there with a report on the mail that he had collected for Dom earlier in the day. There was little chance that either of their phones was tapped. However, after receiving those two disturbing Polaroid snapshots, Dom had decided, and Parker had agreed, that in this case prudence and paranoia were synonymous. Bills, Parker said, advertisements, no more strange messages, and no more Polaroids. How's it going at your end? Nothing so far, Dom said, leaning warily against the plexiglass and aluminum wall of the phone booth. Didn't sleep well last night. But you didn't go for a walk? Didn't even get one knot untied. Had a nightmare, though, the moon again. Anybody follow you to that payphone? Not unless he was thin as a dime and a master of camouflage, Parker said. So you can call me here again tomorrow night and not have to worry that they've tapped the line. We sound like two madmen, Dom said. I'm kind of having fun, Parker said. Cops and robbers, hide and seek, spies. I was always good at games like that when I was a kid. You just hang in there, my friend, and if you need help, I'll come fast. I know, Dom said. He walked back to the motel through a cold, damp wind. As in the hotel in Portland, he woke 3 times before dawn, always servicing from an unremembered nightmare, always shouting about the moon. Tuesday, January 7th, Dom rose early and drove to Sacramento, then took Interstate 80 east toward Reno. Rain fell silvery and cold for most of the drive, and by the time he reached the foothills of the Sierras, it was snowing. He stopped at an Arco station, bought tire chains, and put them on before heading into the mountains. The summer before last, he'd taken more than 10 hours to get from Grants Pass to Reno, and this time the drive took even longer. When he finally checked in at Harrah's Hotel, where he had stayed before, called Parker Fain from a payphone, and had a bite of dinner in the coffee shop, he was too tired to do anything but pick up a copy of the Reno newspaper and return to his room. So at 8:30 that evening, sitting in bed in his underwear, he saw the story about Zebediah Lomack. And then, on the next page in the book, it has I guess it's supposed to be a news article, title, or headline, Moon Man's estate worth $500,000, Reno. Zebediah Harold Lomack, 50, whose suicide on Christmas Day led to the discovery of his bizarre obsession with the moon, left an estate valued at more than $500,000. According to documents filed with the probate court by Eleanor Wolseley, sister of the deceased and executrix of Lomack's will, most of the funds are in accounts at various savings and loan associations and in treasury bills. The modest house in which Lomack lived at 1420 Wasp Valley Road has an appraised value of only $35,000. Lomack, a professional gambler, is said to have amassed his wealth primarily from the game of poker. He was one of the best players I ever knew, said Sydney Sierra Sid Garfork of Reno, another professional gambler and winner of last year's World Championship of Poker at Binion's Horseshoe Casino in Las Vegas. He took to cards when he was just a kid, the way some others might have a natural knack for baseball or math or physics. According to Garfork and other friends of Lomack, the gambler's estate would have been even larger if he had not had a weakness for dice games. He lost back more than half his winnings at the craps tables, and the IRS took a big chunk, of course, Garfork said. On Christmas night, responding to a neighbor's report of shotgun fire, Reno police officers found Lomack's body in the garbage-strewn kitchen of his home. Upon further investigation, they found thousands of photographs of the moon decorating walls, ceilings, and furniture. There was more to the story, which had apparently been a local sensation for the past 2 weeks. Dom read with growing fascination and uneasiness. Most likely, Zebediah Lomack's mad obsession with the moon had nothing to do with Dom's own problems. Coincidence. Yet he felt a stirring of precisely that fear, part terror, part horror, and part awe, that filled him when he woke from his nightmares, that also overwhelmed him when he went sleepwalking and tried to nail windows shut. He pored over the article several times, and at 9:15, in spite of his weariness, he decided that he had to get a look in the Lomack house. He dressed, retrieved his rental car from the hotel's valet parking, and got directions to Wasp Valley Road from the attendant. Reno was below the snow line, so the night was dry and the roads clean. Dom stopped at an all-night save-on drugstore to buy a flashlight. He arrived at 1420 Wasp Valley Road shortly after 10 o'clock and parked across the street. The house was actually a bungalow with large porches, every bit as modest as the news account had indicated. It sat on a half-acre lot. From previous storms, snow lay in patches on the roof, covered the lawn, weighted the branches of several large pines. The windows were dark. According to the article in the Reno newspaper, Eleanor Wolseley, Zebediah Lomax's sister, had flown in from Florida 3 days after his death on December 28th. She arranged the funeral services, which had been conducted on the 30th, and was staying over until the estate was settled. However, she was at a hotel rather than in her brother's house because the bungalow was too depressing. Dom was a law-abiding citizen. The prospect of breaking into the house gave him no thrill, but it had to be done because there was no way he could see it except by forced entry. He saw no point in trying to persuade Eleanor Wolseley to allow a visit tomorrow, for she had been quoted in the newspaper as saying that she was sick and tired of gawkers, and that she was repulsed by the perverse curiosity of strangers. 5 minutes later, on the back porch of the Lomax bungalow, Dom discovered that the door was equipped with a deadbolt in addition to its regular lock. He tried the windows that faced onto the porch. The one above the kitchen sink was unlatched. He slid it open and clambered inside. Holding the flashlight with one hand to avoid drawing the notice of anyone outside, he swept the narrowed beam around the kitchen, which was no longer in the disgusting condition in which Reno policemen had found it on Christmas. According to the newspaper, just 2 days ago, Lomax's sister began cleaning the house and preparing it for sale. Evidently, she had started here. The garbage was gone. The counters were clean and the floor was spotless. The air was filled with the stink of new paint and spectricide. A single startled roach scurried along the baseboard and disappeared behind the refrigerator, but there was no longer a gross infestation, and there were no pictures of the moon. Dom was suddenly worried that Eleanor Wolseley and her helpers might have made too much progress. Perhaps all traces of Zebediah Lomax's obsession had been stripped down, scrubbed out, and thrown away. But that concern was quickly put to rest when Dom followed the pale probing beam of the flashlight into the living room, where the walls and ceiling and windows were still papered with big posters of the moon. It seemed as if he were hanging in deep space, in some crowded realm where 100 cratered worlds orbited impossibly close to one another. The effect was disorienting. He felt dizzy and his mouth went dry. He moved slowly out of the living room into a hallway where hundreds of pictures of the moon, some color and some black and white, some large and some small, some overlapping others, had been fixed to every inch of the walls with glue, Scotch tape, masking tape, and staples. The same decorations had been applied in both bedrooms as well, so the omnipresent moons seemed almost like a fungus that had spored and spread throughout the house, creeping into every corner. The newspaper report had said that no one but Lomax had been in the house for more than a year prior to his suicide. Dom believed it, for if visitors had seen the work of this lunatic cut-and-paste Michelangelo, they would have contacted the mental health authorities at once. The neighbors told of the gambler's rapid metamorphosis from a hail fellow to a recluse. Apparently, his fascination with the moon had begun the summer before last. The summer before last. The timing uncannily paralleled the changes in Dom's own life. Second by second, Dom grew more uneasy. He could not understand the insane behavior that had created this eerie display. He could not put himself inside the fevered mind of Lomax, but he could empathize with the gambler's terror. Just moving through the moon-crowded house, shining his flashlight on the lunar faces, Dom felt a tingling along the back of his neck. The moons did not mesmerize him as they had evidently mesmerized Lomac, but as he stared at them, he sensed instinctively that the impulse that had driven Lomac to paper his house with moon images was the same impulse that drove Dom himself to dream of them. He and Lomac had shared some experience in which the moon had figured, or of which it was an apt and powerful symbol. The summer before last, they had been in the same place at the same time, the wrong place at the wrong time. Lomac had been driven mad by the stress of repressed memories. Will I be driven mad too? Dom wondered as he stood in the master bedroom, turning slowly in a circle. A new and grim thought struck him. Suppose Lomac had not killed himself out of despair over his unshakable obsession, but had instead been compelled to shove the shotgun barrel into his mouth because he had finally remembered what had happened to him the summer before last. Maybe the memory was far worse than the mystery. Maybe, if the truth were revealed, sleepwalking and nightmares would seem less terrifying than what had happened during that drive from Portland to Mountain View. Moons. The oppressiveness of those pendulant forms drastically increased. The claustrophobic mural made breathing difficult. The moon seemed to portend some unreadable but manifestly evil fate that awaited him, and he stumbled out of the room, suddenly eager to flee from them. Among a herd of leaping and prancing shadows whipped up by the bobbling beam of the flashlight, he ran down the short hall into the living room, tripped over a stack of books, and fell with a jarring crash. For a moment he lay stunned, but his senses swiftly cleared, and he was jolted to find himself staring at the word Dominic, which was scrawled in felt-tip pen across the luminous moon face in one of the dozens of identical big posters. He had not noticed it when he had come through from the kitchen earlier, but now he had fallen so that the flash in his right hand was aimed just right. A chill rippled through Dom. He had read nothing about this in the newspaper, but the handwriting surely belonged to Lomac. To the best of his knowledge, he had not known the gambler, yet to pretend that this was another Dominic would be to embrace an outrageous coincidence. He got up from the floor and took a couple of steps toward the poster that bore his name, stopping 6 feet from it. In the penumbra of the flashlight beam, he saw writing on an adjacent poster. His own name was only one of 4 that Lomac had scribbled across 4 lunar images. Dominic, Ginger, Faye, Ernie. If his name was here because he had shared a forgotten nightmarish experience with Lomac, then the other 3 must have been fellow sufferers as well, though Dom could remember nothing whatsoever about them. He thought of the priest in the Polaroid snapshot. Was that Ernie? And the blonde strapped to the bed, was she Ginger or Faye? As he moved the light from one name to the other and back again, some dark and awesome memory did indeed stir in him, but it remained far down in his subconscious, an amorphous blur like a giant ocean creature swimming past, just below the mottled surface of a murky sea, its existence revealed only by the rippled wake of its passage, and by the flicker of shadow and light in the water. He tried to reach out for the memory and seize it, but it dove deep and vanished. From the moment he had come into the Lomac place, Dom had been in the hands of fear, but now frustration took an even tighter grip on him. He shouted in the empty house, and his voice echoed coldly off the moon-papered walls. Why can't I remember? He knew why, of course. Someone had mucked with his mind, scrubbing out certain memories. But still he shouted, fearful, furious. Why can't I remember? I've got to remember. He held his left hand toward the poster that featured his name, as if to wrench from its substance the memory that had been in Lomac's mind when he had scrawled Dominic. His heart thumped. He roared with hot anger. God damn it, God damn you, whoever you are. I will remember. I will remember, you sons of bitches, you bastards. I will. Suddenly, impossibly, even though he was not touching it, though his hand was still a few feet from it, the poster bearing his name tore loose from the wall. It was fixed in place with 4 strips of masking tape angled across its corners, but the tape peeled up with the sound of zippers opening, and the poster leapt off the wall, as if a wind had blown straight through the lath and plaster behind it. With the rattle and rustle of paper wings, it swooped at him, and he staggered back across the living room in surprise, nearly falling over the books again. In his unsteady hand, his flashlight revealed that the poster had stopped a few feet from him. It hung at eye level, unsupported in thin air, undulating slightly from top to bottom, first bulging out at him and then bending away when the direction of undulation reversed itself. As the pock surface of that moon rippled, his own handwritten name fluttered and writhed as if it were the legend on a wind-stirred banner. Hallucination, he thought desperately, but he knew it was really happening. He could not breathe, as if the cold air were so syrup-thick with miraculous power that it could not be inhaled. The poster floated closer. His hand shook, the flashlight jiggled. Sharp glints of light lanced off the undulant surface of the glossy paper. After a timeless moment in which the only sound was the crackle of the animated poster, other noise abruptly arose from every part of the room. The zipper sound of masking tape being pulled loose on the ceiling, walls, and windows. The other posters simultaneously disengaged themselves. With a brittle clatter, rattle, whoosh, 100 moon images exploded toward Dom from every direction, and he cried out in surprise and fear. The loosed cry was like a blockage expelled from his windpipe, for he was suddenly able to breathe. The last of the tape pulled loose. 50 posters hung unmoving in midair, not even rippling, as if pasted firmly to nothing whatsoever. The silence in the dead gambler's house was as profound as in a temple devoid of worshippers, a cold and penetrating silence that seemed to pierce to the core of Dom, seeking to replace even the soft liquid susurration of his blood's movement through his arteries and veins. Then, as if they were 50 parts of a single mechanism brought to life with the flick of a switch, the 3-by-5-foot lunar images shivered, rustled, flapped. Although there was not the slightest breeze to propel them, they began to whirl around the room in the orderly manner of horses on a carousel. Dom stood in the middle of that eerie merry-go-round, and the moon circled him. They capered and twirled, curled and uncurled, flexed and flapped, here seen as half-moons, and here as crescents, and here full face. And they waxed and waned, ascended and descended, faster, faster, faster still. In the flashlight glow, it seemed like a procession set in motion by the sorcerer's apprentice who, in the old story, had magically imparted life to a bunch of broomsticks. Dom's fear receded, making room for wonder. At the moment, there seemed no threat in the phenomenon. In fact, a wild delight burgeoned in him. He could think of no explanation for what he was witnessing, but stood in dumb astonishment, puzzled and amazed. Usually nothing was so terrifying as the unknown, but perhaps he sensed a benign power at work. Wonderstruck, he turned slowly in a circle, watching the moons parade around him, and at last a tremulous laugh escaped him. In an instant, the mood changed dramatically. In a cacophony of imitation wings, the posters flew at Dom as if they were 50 enormous and furious bats. They swooped and darted over his head, slapped his face, beat against his back. Though they were not alive, he attributed malevolent intent to their assault. He put one arm across his face and flailed at the moons with the hand that held the flashlight, but they did not fall back. The noise grew louder and more frantic as the paper wings beat on the chilly air and on one another. His previous delight forgotten, Don stumbled across the room in a panic, searching for the way out, but he could see nothing but zooming, soaring, spinning moons. No doors, no windows. He staggered one way, then another, disoriented. The noise grew still worse as, in the hallways and other rooms of the bungalow, 1,000 moons began to tear free of their petrified orbits upon the walls. Tape pulled loose and staples popped out of plaster, and glue suddenly lost its adhesiveness. 1,000 cratered moon forms, and then 1,000 more, detached themselves and rose into suspension, with 10,000 rustles, spun and swooped toward the living room, with 100,000 clicks and crackles and hisses, swinging into orbit around Dom, with a steadily swelling roar that sounded as if he were immersed in raging flames. The glossy full-color pictures torn from magazines and books now flashed and sparkled and shimmered as they darted through the flashlight beam, contributing to the scintillant illusion of fire, and the black and white pictures cascaded down and spiraled up like bits of ash caught in thermal currents. Gasping for breath, he sucked in slick paper and newsprint moons and had to spit them out. Thousands of small paper worlds seethed around him in layer upon layer, and when he hysterically parted one curtain composed of false planetoids, there was only another behind it. Intuitively, he perceived that this impossible display was meant to help him break through to a full recollection of his unremembered nightmares. He had no idea who or what lay behind the phenomenon, but he sensed the purpose. If he immersed himself in the storm of moons and let them sweep him away, he'd understand his dreams, understand the frightening cause of them, and know what had happened to him on the road 18 months ago. But he was too scared to let go and be drawn into a trance by the mesmerizing weave and bobble of the pale spheres. He longed for that revelation, but was terrified of it. He said, "No, no." He pressed his hands over his ears and squeezed his eyes shut. "Stop it, stop it." His heart hammered 2 beats to each exclamation. "Stop it." His throat cracked as his cries broke loose. "Stop it." He was astonished when the tumult was cut off with the suddenness of a symphony orchestra, terminating a thunderous crescendo on one last bone-shaking note. He did not expect his shouted commands to be obeyed, and he still did not think his words had done the trick. He took his hands away from his ears. He opened his eyes. A galaxy full of moons hung around him. With a trembling hand, he plucked one of the pictures from its unsupported perch upon the air. Wonderingly, he turned it over in his hand, tested its substance between 2 fingers. There was nothing special about the picture, yet it had been suspended magically before him, just as thousands more were still suspended, motionless. "How?" he said shakily, as if the moons, being able to levitate, ought also to be able to speak. "How? Why?" The moons fell as one, as by the breaking of some spell. The thousands of pieces of paper dropped straight to the floor, where they lay in uneven heaps, in a drift over Dom's winter boots, with no lingering trace of the mysterious life force that had possessed them. Bewildered and half in shock, Dom shuffled toward the doorway that led to the hall. The moons crunched and rustled like dry autumn leaves. At the door he stopped and played his flashlight beam slowly over the short corridor, where not a single lunar image remained moored by staples, tape, or glue. The walls had been stripped bare. Turning, he took a couple of steps into the center of the living room once more, then knelt among the debris. He put down the glowing flashlight and sifted paper moons through his trembling hands, trying to understand what he had seen. Within him, fear fought delighted amazement, and terror battled awe. But in truth, he could not decide how he ought to feel, because there was no precedent for what he had experienced. One moment a giddy laugh began to build, but then joy was frozen by a breath of cold horror. Now he felt he'd been in the presence of something unspeakably evil, but now he was just as convinced it had been something good and pure. Evil, good. Perhaps both, or neither. Just, well, something. Some mysterious thing beyond the descriptive, definitive power of words. He knew one thing only. Whatever had happened to him the summer before last was far stranger than he had realized heretofore. Still sifting paper moons through his fingers, he noticed something unusual in his hands. He brought them palms up into the direct beam of the flashlight. Rings. On each palm blazed a ring of swollen red skin, each as perfect as if the inflamed tissues had conformed to a pattern drawn with a draftsman's compass. Even as he watched, the stigmata faded, vanished. It was Tuesday, January 7th. 6, Chicago, Illinois. In his bedroom on the second floor of St. Bernadette's Rectory, Father Stefan Wykazik woke to the thump of a drum. The beat had the deep boom of a bass drum and the hollow reverberation of timpani. It sounded like the pounding of an enormous heart, although it embellished the simple two-stroke rhythm of the heart with an extra beat. Lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub. Bewildered and still half asleep, Stefan switched on the lamp, squinted in the blaze of light, and looked at his alarm clock. It was 2:07 Thursday morning, certainly not a reasonable hour for a parade. Lub-dub-dub, lub-dub-dub. After each triad of thumps, there was a 3-second pause, then a set of beats identical to all the others, then another 3-second pause. The precise timing and unfaltering repetition of the noise began to seem less like the work of a drummer and more like the laborious piston stroke of an enormous machine. Father Wykazik threw back the covers and padded barefoot to the window that looked out on the courtyard between the rectory and the church. He saw only snow and bare-limbed trees and the backwash of the carriage lamp above the sacristy door. The beats grew louder and the pause between the groups shortened to about 2 seconds. He took his robe from the back of a chair and slipped it on over his pajamas. The sonorous pounding was so loud now that it was no longer merely an annoyance and puzzlement. It had begun to frighten Stefan. Each burst of sound rattled the window panes and shook the door in its frame. He hurried into the upstairs hall. He fumbled in the dark for the wall switch and finally turned on the overhead light. Farther along the short hall on the right, another door opened, and Father Michael Girano, Stefan's other curate, dashed out of his room, struggling into his own robe. "What is that?" "Don't know," Stefan said. The next triple thud was twice as loud as the group preceding it, and the entire house reverberated as if it had been struck by 3 gigantic hammers. It was not a hard, sharp sound, but muffled in spite of its loudness, as if the hammers were thinly padded, yet swung with tremendous force. The lights flickered. Now the thumps were separated by no more than a second of silence, not long enough for the echo of the previous fulminations to fade away. And with each powerful hammering, the lights flickered again, and the floor under Stefan trembled. In the same instant, Father Wykazik and Father Girano perceived the locus of the noise, Brendan Cronin's room. They moved swiftly to that door, which was directly across the hall from Father Girano. Incredibly, Brendan was fast asleep. In spite of the thunderous explosions that made Father Wykazik flash back to the mortar fire of Vietnam, Brendan dreamed on untroubled. In fact, in the pulsing light, there seemed to be a vague smile tugging at the young priest's lips. The windows rattled. Drapery hooks clicked against the rods to which they were attached. On the dresser, a hairbrush bounced up and down, and several coins clinked together, and Brendan's breviary slid first to the left and then to the right. On the wall above the bed, a crucifix jiggled wildly under the picture hook from which it was hung. Father Girano shouted, but Stefan could not hear what the curate said, for now there were no pauses between muffled detonations. With each tripartite beat, Father Wykazik retreated further from his initial mental image of a huge drum, and became increasingly convinced that what he was hearing was the throbbing of some enormous and immeasurably powerful machine. But it seemed as if the sound came from all sides, as if the machinery was hidden within the walls of the house itself, laboring at some mysterious and unknowable task. As the breviary finally slid off the dresser and the coins began to spill to the floor, Father Geronimo backed to the doorway and stood there wide-eyed, as if he might flee. But Stefan went to the bed, bent over the dozing priest, and shouted his name. When that had no effect, he grabbed Brendan by the shoulders and shook him. The auburn-haired curate blinked and opened his eyes. The hammering stopped abruptly. The sudden cessation of thunderous noise jolted Father Wachsig as badly as the first boom that had shattered his sleep. He let go of Brendan and looked around the room, disbelieving. "I was so close," Brendan said dreamily. "I wish you hadn't wakened me. I was so close." Stefan pulled aside the covers, took hold of the curate's hands, and turned them palms up. There was an angry red ring in each palm. Stefan stared at them in fascination, for this was the first time that he had seen the stigmata. What in God's name is this all about, he wondered. Breathing hard, Father Geronimo approached the bed. Staring at the rings, he said, "What are those from?" Ignoring the question, Father Wachsig spoke to Brendan. "What was that sound? Where did it come from?" "Calling," Brendan said in a voice still thick with sleep, and with a soft, excited pleasure. "Calling me back." "What was calling you?" Stefan demanded. Brendan blinked, sat up, and leaned against the headboard. His eyes had been out of focus. Now his gaze cleared, and he really looked at Father Wachsig for the first time. "What happened? You heard it too?" "Somehow, yes," Stefan said. "It shook the whole house. Amazing." "What was it, Brendan?" "A call. It was calling me, and I was following the call." "But what was calling you?" I don't know. Something. Calling me back." "Back where?" Brendan frowned. "Back into the light. The golden light of the dream I told you about." "What's this all about?" Father Geronimo persisted. His voice was shaky, for he was not as accustomed to the miraculous as were his rector and his fellow curate. "Will somebody clue me in?" The other priest continued to ignore him. To Brendan, Stefan said, "This golden light, what is it? Could it have been God calling you back to his fold?" "No," Brendan said, "just something calling me back. Next time, maybe I'll get a better look at it." Father Wachsig sat on the edge of the bed. "You think this will happen again? You think it'll keep calling to you?" "Yes," Brendan said. "Oh, yes." It was Thursday, January 9th.